Good afternoon. Today I will talk about the Easter Offensive, what happened before it, what happened during the event, and what happened after. We'll also cover its connections to other historical events. The Easter Offensive took place during the Vietnam War, during the final 3 years to be exact, from 1972 to 1975 when the war ended. The time period before 1972 involved numerous battles, attacks, and bombings. One of these notable battles was Operation Starlight, which took place in April of 1965 and involved 5,500 U.S. Marines leading a strike against the 1st Viet Cong Regiment in the first major ground offensive by the U.S. forces in Vietnam. This was a 6-day operation and would defuse the Viet Cong Regiment, although they would recover quickly. In June of 1966, American aircraft attacked targets in Hanoi and Haiphong, two major cities in Vietnam. In February of 1967, less than a year later, Americans bombed Haiphong Harbor and the North Vietnamese airfields. Then, of course, was the Tet Offensive, a shock to the Americans. In January of 1968, the Viet Minh and North Vietnamese armies launched a combined assault, and these attacks were carried out in more than 100 cities across South Vietnam. Notably, Hue, Saigon, and even the U.S. Embassy was not spared. These attacks were deadly, yet surprisingly effective, and they caught the U.S. completely off guard and would mark a turning point in the war, where the U.S. would begin their gradual withdrawal from the region. What happened during the Easter Offensive only took place due to North Vietnam's unbeatable desire to win the war. Hanoi's desire for a military victory was understandable, as the North Vietnamese had been fighting this war for many decades, and a clear-cut triumph on the battlefield would favor them during negotiations in Paris heavily. Months before Easter in 1972, a warning of the possibility of a communist attack was issued, but Saigon and Washington severely underestimated the magnitude of the coming attack. This gave North Vietnam the element of surprise. Hanoi's invading forces thrust into three of South Vietnam's four military regions. The Communists relied on bad weather, which would neglect the fact that the U.S. had air superiority over the Communists. Initially, South Vietnam would be overwhelmed, particularly in the northernmost provinces, and they couldn't handle the Communist army. For example, they abandoned their provinces in Quang Tri and fled south. In Military Region 2, 20,000 Communist soldiers surged out of Laotian and Cambodian sanctuaries in order to attack the cities of Kon Tum and Pleiku. The strategy was to cut off Pleiku and continue marching forward, which would split South Vietnam in half and sever communication lines and any transportation lines. South Vietnam troops fought well, however, Kon Tum was cut off and surrounded fast. A massive air resupply effort would eventually save the city, but casualties were high, so though it was technically a South Vietnam victory, it felt more like a loss. In Military Region Number 3, one regular North Vietnamese division, combined with two Viet Cong divisions with a combined total of 30,000 men, led an attack on An Loc and Loc Ninh. Fighting continued all over South Vietnam into the summer months, and in May, the North Vietnamese army had taken Quang Tri and put Hue, Kon Tum, and An Loc under siege. An Loc especially was on the verge of crumbling, and if it did, it would be a devastating loss for the South Vietnamese. This is because if An Loc fell, there would be practically nothing between the North Vietnamese army and Saigon, the most important city in South Vietnam. An Loc would eventually fall, and this is when President Nixon authorized an upgrade of American air power, as well as heavy strikes against Hanoi and Haiphong. On the 8th of May, Saigon still hanging by a thread, the U.S. Navy mined Haiphong Harbor to block the flow of Soviet supplies. Ultimately, the South Vietnamese, supported by American air power, would be able to drive the North Vietnamese army back from the cities, and recaptured Quang Tri in September, and then finally drove the North Vietnamese out of South Vietnam for good, officially ending the Eastern Offensive. After the withdrawal of the U.S. troops in 1973, Communist forces would end the war by taking over South Vietnam and unifying the nation once again under communism. The casualties were heavy on both sides. The North Vietnamese lost 100,000 men, while the South Vietnamese lost 43,000, 10,000 of which were killed. 25,000 civilians were also killed, along with over a million left homeless. The Easter Offensive obviously relates to the Vietnam War, as it was one of the key events of the entire war. It impacted both sides, who both suffered heavy casualties and most certainly played a role in the negotiation process. The Easter Offensive was also surprisingly similar to the Civil Rights Movement due to the protests that took place. During the Vietnam War, protests were organized to protest against America's involvement when the war was not going America's way. Protests were also organized during the Civil Rights Movement to protest segregation. A surprising similarity between both sets of protests were that they were both organized by students in many cases. For example, a student for a democratic society organized many anti-war protests, while various universities and their students organized and even took part in many civil rights protests. In conclusion, though the Easter Offensive did not really achieve its intended result of unifying Vietnam immediately, it was a catalyst for the eventual communist takeover, and it was one of the most significant events that took place during the Vietnam War.